Welcome to the Farmhouse. I'm Stephanie Spiker.
I'm Candace Worsbowski.
And today we have on a special guest who is someone that Candace and I have kind of sort of gotten to know, even though we've never actually talked to her before. Her name is Laura Zoeller, and she actually writes a column for us in Lancaster Farming. It's called Of Family, Faith, and Farming. Laura's column can be found in our B section and also on our website at lancasterfarming.com. And yeah, by reading it, I feel like we both got to know her a lot.
Yeah, I've wanted to talk to Laura ever since we decided that we were going to do this podcast. Her journey to farming is different than most women's, I think. Laura married a farmer once upon a time, and then unfortunately a few years ago he passed away, and Laura decided to maintain the farm. She works with her son, and they have continued to farm their operation since her husband's passing. And a lot of the times her column is about how they are adjusting to farming by themselves. Sometimes it means teaching themselves how to do something new. Sometimes it means having to get themselves out of a sticky situation. If there are, cows on the lamb, rolling
hay bales on the lamb.
Yeah. So I've been interested to hear a little bit more about her life and her experience as she's kind of come into her own as a farmer.
Yeah, and I mean, the operation, they have a lot going on. Her and her son is Zoeller Farms LLC. It's mainly a cow-calf operation, but they also raise broilers, laying hens, hogs, and they do custom baling. So they have a lot going on between the two of them.
Right, and she also has an off-farm job. So, like many of the women that we talk to on here, she is juggling a lot. So let's invite her in and hear what she has to say.
Laura Zoeller, welcome to the Farmhouse. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we always start everyone off with the same question, which is, did you always want to work in agriculture?
The short answer is no. I wanted to be a writer, which I do some freelancing and have written a book and, contributed to magazines and stuff, but not as my general vocation either. I did grow up on farmland that had been a dairy at one time. In the old-fashioned, we have enough cows to make milk for ourselves, and if there's extra, we'll sell it sense. It was my father's property. But by the time I have memories of being there, there were only 2 or 3 cows left that weren't really being milked anymore. So I got into farming when I met my husband.
Wonderful. So not to get too emotional too quickly, but we're aware through your writing that unfortunately your husband passed away a few years ago, but you've been carrying on the farm since, which I'm sure has been challenging on many levels, emotionally, obviously, but also I would imagine mentally and physically as well. What's been the toughest part of taking on the farm and all of its responsibilities since your husband's passing?
Probably a couple different things. First and foremost is just the physical aspects of it. It was all set up the way that he was able to do things, and I am no physical match for him. I'm not physically able to do some of the feats of strength that he was able to do. So trying to figure out how to end up with the same or better results with completely different tactics has been a big challenge. Certainly the emotional element of seeing that everything that I'm touching is something that we kind of built together. This was his family farm, but we took it from, again, a couple of cows and maybe a few chickens to custom selling beef and different things like that. So we built it into something, and, a little bit of the fear of losing what he spent his life building for us also. So, and time, this farm was his job. He did it 15 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I have a job that keeps me away from home about 12 hours a day, 5 days a week. So that is a massive impact in the ability to keep up with things, let alone make any kind of progress. So a lot of challenges since he's passed.
Yeah, I'm sure. But, where do you find the joy in farming? Because there's got to be something there that keeps you going?
Spring.
Mm-hmm.
When everything greens up again and the calves are all born. We have, I think, 14 or 15 calves on the ground that are starting to run around and frolic, and they're just so happy to be alive. That reminds me that in every challenging season, there's a sense of renewal that comes after it if we can just hold on. So that is definitely a big part of it. But also, we had 3 children together, and my youngest is our only son, and he wants to continue. So seeing the ways that we manage to make things work, the way we're capable of doing them. We taught ourselves to bale hay 6 months after my husband passed away. And, we had, between the two of us, we had mowed, raked, tedded, stacked, hauled home, but we had never run either of our balers. And, we only destroyed a couple of fences and lost a half a dozen round bales before we figured it out. So, when we figure out a way to communicate and get the job done and we have success, that reminds me that we're capable and that I still have the ability to pass the dream that my husband and I had together independently on to my son.
I think a lot of people can relate to the joy that spring brings with it. It's like palpable relief that, the weather is going to turn and it's going to get warmer, and hopefully we can put those cold, dark days behind us.
Definitely. Daylight savings time. Oh man, that's like my favorite weekend. Everybody hates that we lose that hour. I'm like, but we get this daylight back.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not driving home from work in the dark to do chores in the dark anymore. It's a good thing for me.
Yeah. So obviously, you write a column for Lancaster Farming, and kind of before this interview, I feel like I did a pretty deep dive and read a bunch of your columns, which I've read a few in the past, but I don't know if I've ever read all of them, and I really enjoyed them. And one thing that I feel like came up a lot was you mentioned a lot of times like friends and other farmers that have helped you, be that with advice or hands-on help. And so like, just what have you learned about the farming community like throughout your years being involved in it, especially in these last couple of years?
I think that sometimes farming can feel like you're alone in the trenches, but you're really not. Asking for help is very hard for most people, and certainly always was for me, especially because, my husband was so gifted in so many things that we were very self-sufficient in virtually everything. But again, knowing that I didn't know enough on my own made it necessary that I ask for help. The fastest way to lose everything would have been to stay isolated and not ask for help. And I don't think people really ask, especially farmers, if they can help, if they don't mean it. So I definitely took people up on their offers and their suggestions. There's a shortage of large animal vets. We do have a very good vet in Washington County now, Caitlin Moore, but she is new to the area and she's the only one, and she's spread very thin. And so you can have a really bad problem happen before she's physically able to get to you. And so the community of farmers that I have discovered largely since my husband passed, they're so willing to share their information because they've been the one on the other end of it alone trying to figure it out. And I think that in a lot of senses, they know that we're just better together. We're able to help one another and, be safe and be successful in an industry that already beats us down so much. There's no reason to withhold information and, what do they call that? Gatekeeping or something like that. Like there's no reason for it. We're, I'm not trying to take over your process. You're not trying to take over my process, but if we can help each other, we're all more successful. And as an industry, we need to stick together.
Yeah. And I mean, it's definitely, it's tough to actually like realize like, okay, I do need to actually go out and ask for help. But I feel like, especially with farmers, as a community, they are very willing to lend a hand when someone needs it. So kudos to you for being brave enough to be like, hey, I could use some help here.
Well, if we're being 100% honest, there were a lot of tear-filled phone calls as well. And I think some of them just took pity on me so I'd stop crying.
Oh, I'm sure even if you weren't crying, a lot of them would have been willing to help.
They would have. They're good guys. But I think that may have been a catalyst to get them there quicker.
Hey, whatever works, right? So another thing
I'm very grateful.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Another thing that stood out to me in some of your columns is how often you talked about treating animals humanely and with compassion. And there was one column specifically where you were talking about your one daughter who kind of liked to play Dr. Dolittle. And it made me cry because there was something where you said, she said that I just want them to know that someone cared when she was talking about like injured animals she brought home, which just touched me so much. So, this philosophy of treating animals humanely really, I think, came from your husband, you said. So why is it such an important philosophy that your husband held, and why is it now so important to you?
I'm not 100% sure why he felt that way about all the animals, except to say that he always said that animals and older people have a hard time taking care of themselves sometimes. They're at our mercy. As far as the chickens, they're in a coop most of the time. They don't eat. They don't have water if we don't provide it to them. And with that responsibility to take care of them comes a responsibility to treat them, in a certain way. And as long as they were on our property, they were treated that way, even if they were on the way to the butcher. From a kind of a practical standpoint, the produce that comes from an animal, your meat or whatever, has, at least anecdotally, better quality when the animal is treated better. There's, less endorphins, there's less hormones that are pumped into the produce itself. So there is that practical part of it. But I think, part of it was just that he was a dog person. That we always had at least one dog, and they had, in some cases, I joked, more rights and privileges than I did. And he would laugh. And, in particular, the first dog that we had when we got together, he said, well, he's been here longer than you, so he just had an affinity for animals. And he just, he could walk out in the middle of our herd of cows and scratch their noses. And, you could move them from field to field easier if they weren't scared of you. Now that comes with its own challenges. When you're as kind to them as you possibly can, they don't want to move. They're not going to move because they know you're not going to do anything to them. But, that's just a better policy, I think. So in the first year after he passed away, we tried to end up with the same results that he had. So we had to do things differently, but there was only one way that we knew how things should be achieved, or how things should be at the end of the day. And so we just started off doing things the same way that he had always done them, to the best of our ability. And some of that stuff just makes sense to continue doing. If I go into my chicken coop and every one of them flaps and squawks and throws up dirt, that's a miserable experience for everybody. Mm-hmm. But if I can go in there and walk between them to get to the feeders or to gather the eggs, again, that's better for the health of everyone.
Great. I mean, I'm glad you kind of brought up, the learning aspect of it all, because it kind of leads to my next question. I also enjoy reading your column.
Thank you.
Some of my favorite columns of yours have been the ones where something has gone sideways on the farm, from escaped cows to, you kind of mentioned, the runaway hay bales. And I know these things were probably very stressful when they were occurring, but, the lessons learned from them have always been thoughtful. And I'm sure with time you can see the humor in them. So looking back, what have been some of your favorite or most memorable learning experiences while farming?
I do so many things wrong. It's hard to pick which ones have been my favorite. And I used to joke, well, I've got to write about this because I got to recoup some of the time and money I had into the fixes, But, I think part of this answer comes down to my faith. I have a deep faith in Jesus Christ, and I have the overwhelming sense that all of this is going to work out in the way that he believes is best for my life. So the more that I grow into that belief and understanding, the more I'm able to say, this is not the way I want to handle this situation, or this is not where this is going to end up. Like, this is going to be okay. This does not define my identity. I'm rooted deeply somewhere else. That's not to say that I don't occasionally or often, as whichever choice of words you want to use, swear or get frustrated or occasionally throw a hammer or something like that. I certainly do, but being able to recognize that the work to fix whatever I've messed up is still there, whether or not I have a good attitude or a bad attitude. And a lot of times it's just more fun to go back to it if I can find a way to smile even while it's still broken. The better that I have found my relationship with my son to be, and the better I have found I'm able to find solutions to the problems that are often created also by my own hand.
I would also add to that, you're also producing something that is giving joy to people. And I'm talking about your column here. These things, they happen on your farm and they are episodes. But, when people read them, it's, entertainment seems too light a word. But at the same time, it is a diversion of sorts. Or it's like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine like a loose hay bale just rolling through my farm, or even if it's like kind of like the relief of like, oh, thank goodness that didn't happen to me. But it also gives people, time to think about what would I do in that situation, or what could I take away from what Laura went through.
I think that's fair. And I think that occasionally I do get responses to my column. And people will either say something to that effect where they are glad it happened to me, or they will tell me a story where something similar happened to them. And sometimes even that, again, with that isolation, they think they're the only one who's made a mistake of that size or of that magnitude, that caliber, or whatever. And it's like, okay, this is a shared experience. I'm not the only one that has done something like that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely, I'm sure, very nice for people reading it being like, oh, great. Like, I had this issue and I'm not just, over here all alone. So
it's not just me.
Yeah.
And with that hay bale story, I don't know if I mentioned it in the column, but when I went to work the next day and the cows had gotten out, and so I had to go home and put the fence back up, and I ended up so very sunburned that I went to work the following day knowing I was violating our dress code because I had a tank top on. And when my boss came in, he said, "What are you wearing?" And I turned around and I said, "I know I'm not allowed to wear this, but it was this or I couldn't come at all." And he just started laughing, and he was like, "No," he said, "You look awful. Are you sure you can be here?" So, my employer has been extremely, extremely gracious since my husband passed away, that sometimes I have to go home and put the cows back in or have a problem or something like that. And they've, set me up so I can work from home on days that I need to do that and that kind of thing, which also makes it much more feasible for me to be able to keep the farm.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I can empathize. I am someone who unfortunately sunburns very easily. So I can empathize with getting a terrible sunburn, and
it's tough stuff.
Yeah. So I know last year you wrote a few times in your column about how you and your son made like a Final Four style bracket to pick which of your cows you thought would give birth first or last, basically. Did you guys do the same thing this year?
No, but that is mostly because they came so quickly. We did not have time. I had, whatever I said, I had 14 or 15 calves in 13 days.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Okay. No need for a bracket. They're all born. But, kind of going off of that, farming obviously is often like, it's kind of a serious job a lot of the times. Like there's just a lot you have to do and it can be very difficult. So do you think it's important to add some kind of silliness and fun, like making brackets and doing that kind of stuff as well on top of like, all the serious stuff that you have to do?
I do. I think that there is definitely a time and a place where there's no room for humor. For example, when we jackknifed that square bale wagon last
Yeah.
year full of square bales with my daughter in it, nothing funny about that at all. We learned something from it. That's the important thing, and that no one was hurt. The equipment was virtually unscathed. That was virtually a miracle, honestly. But I think that there is definitely a place for humor, even in such a serious industry. It's a dangerous profession. We all know that. And if we can pick and choose sometimes to keep it lighthearted, I think that is just good for the mental health. I also joke that it's either laugh or cry, and I get tired of crying. But I definitely think that if there's a way to make a job more fun so that I don't, dread that tomorrow is the day I have to do this, then I think that it just makes everything more enjoyable, and it makes it more manageable, and it makes it to where things just run smoother because I haven't put that thing off for so long out of just lack of desire to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Do you think farming together has brought you and your son closer? And if so, how?
I think that mostly, yes, it has. Initially, it was extremely challenging because he had spent so much time with my husband, and they had their man-to-man communication style that's extremely different. I apparently give too much information, and he
that might
definitely
just be a thing that all women do, right? Like,
without being stereotypical, I think it's probably fair to say. But I know that he was really frustrated with me at first because I didn't know how to do certain things, and I had to consistently remind him that I didn't do all of these tasks. I was involved in the cows. I, always loved the calves. Hay, I was always participating in that. I didn't mind being out there when we were scraping manure from something. I participated, but I never, there's that mental load that has to go into trying to figure out what needs to be done next. How do we prioritize this? When are we going to need this? So when do we have to start repairing or maintaining it, or doing the annual maintenance, the preventative maintenance, that kind of thing. And he got very, very frustrated with me initially about it, and would say, "You were married to him for almost 20 years. And I would yell back, "It doesn't come through osmosis." And so we had to really work on it. But yes, for him to be able to call me and say, "Hey, we're out of this. Can you stop at the farm store," or vice versa. And to know that he is extremely safe when using the equipment. I don't have to worry quite as much as I initially did. Those kind of things. It's definitely a bond that we would not have had otherwise, for sure.
Yeah. So you've mentioned this a couple times, how you also have an off-farm job. So how do you balance the demands of farm work with the demands of, another full-time job? And do you have any tips for farmers who are trying to do the same?
I think that I am largely blessed that my son is more available than I am and is interested and is capable. I don't think that I would be doing what I'm doing, certainly not in the ways that I'm doing it, if I was on my own and had this job. I tease a good friend of mine all the time. He has chosen to do both, and probably for 25 years. And I just don't understand. My goal is to eventually be able to retire to write and farm. The thing I would say I've had to learn the most, that has certainly been the most different from when my husband was participating, is to prioritize and learn to let some things slide, which is very difficult. If I don't get all the weed whacking in the yard done, okay, I am going to have to keep a housekeeper once a month to help me keep up, because I cannot choose to go run the vacuum if we need to be raking hay. I've really had to reevaluate my expectations of myself, my expectations of what our farm is going to look like and how it's going to operate, and try to make it so that it's manageable without the physical and mental repercussions. Now, that was definitely a learning curve. I did some damage to myself the first year trying to lift too much, and I'm going to have a knee replacement this fall that is definitely related to that. But giving myself enough grace to say, I am really doing the best that I can, and I'm not able to make the mortgage payment if I don't keep this job. This company has been very good to me. And they are flexible with me. Those things are just as important, and they have to have a place. So just trying to blend those two things together has been a challenge, but also very beneficial for me.
I think that's something that we hear from a lot of people that we talk to on this podcast. It's just trying to juggle so much and having to have those kind of regular check-ins with yourself. Like you said, reevaluating what you are capable of taking on, and then having to be, straight with yourself and realizing like, okay, like there are some things I'm going to have to let go. And I think that as women, that is something that a lot of us struggle with, because we put so much on ourselves, because we hold ourselves to such high standards that, that feeling that, like you've almost failed if you haven't reached those standards. It's a balancing act that I think a lot of women relate to, whether they're on the farm or not.
Agreed. And I had a grief counselor tell me after John died to look at the situation and ask yourself, is this a season or is this a lifestyle? And if it's a season, you can more easily manage to do the hard thing. If this is going to be for the rest of your life, you may need to reevaluate whether you're capable of maintaining this for that period of time. And so I tell myself that when we're going into hay season, I'm going to have a lot of late evenings. I'm going to be tired when I go to work. I try to pick up my overtime in the off seasons in the winter time, because there's not a lot I can do when I get home in the dark anyway. But I try to save and have that budgeted for the summertime when I need to cut out at my actual quit time every day for 5 or 6 days to do hay. And I also save my PTO as much as possible. I heard on a previous podcast of yours I was listening to that, there's no downtime, I think somebody said, and that, vacation, what is that? And so, we don't go on beach vacations. If I'm lucky to get a 3-day weekend where we're not doing hay, maybe we'll drive up to Erie or something, or go to one of the fairs or something like that. But that's how I'm managing it for sure. And I say that season I can manage it for. So that season versus lifetime thing has really helped me gain some perspective. And in all honesty as well, something that helped right after John died, I kept saying, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. And I was so overwhelmed, I couldn't even process what to start. Where I said, it's like an onion, you have to start at the core of the onion, but I can't peel enough layers away to see where to start. And so my sister came, and every time she heard me say I have to do this, she wrote it down. And then she had me break a piece of paper into 4 quadrants, which were the seasons: spring, summer, autumn, winter. What has to be done right now? What can be done in the spring? What can be done? What can wait till next winter? And so then I only had to focus, and it was written down, I only had to focus on 1/4 of that at a time, and it made it all feel more manageable as well.
I mean, that's a great coping technique.
Yeah.
I think if people are feeling overwhelmed. We're going to pivot away from the farm for a little bit, because as you mentioned earlier, you've written a book. So we wanted to ask you to tell us about your book. What inspired you to write it?
Sure. I wrote a novel called Twisted Roots. It follows the story of a woman named Quinn, largely Quinn, and then her sister Mickey is also in it. And they are trying to figure out how to have healthy adult relationships after suffering a lifetime of abuse at the hands of their father. What inspired me to write it? Some of the stuff in there is based in fact, as I think a lot of novels are. And I was trying to figure out some of that stuff for myself. The way that people raise children has changed a lot in the last 40 years, and things that would just be like, yeah, that guy needs arrested. Today, that's not how it was viewed back in the day. And so some of it is based on my own experience, and then it was novelized, so to speak. But it was kind of a way for me to process through that and also just use up some extra creative juices that I had flowing. So I joke that I wrote it in about 2 weeks, that I was surprised by some of the things the characters did, which kind of was weird since I was writing them, but I was like, oh my gosh, this is what they would do, even though it's not what I want them to do, So, and then the editing process took a long time for me, and the finding the ability to get over the vulnerability of sharing something that I had created, where so many opinions could then be assessed upon it, was a little challenging for me. But I'm glad that I did it, and I have enjoyed the feedback and responses I've gotten so far. And maybe I'll follow up with some of the requests for a second one down the line.
Oh, that's exciting.
But not at least until winter.
Yes.
Right. Well, congratulations. I mean, that's a big achievement. And people can they can get Twisted Roots on Amazon. I saw, and we'll put a link to that in the episode notes, so that if anyone's interested, they can go check it out.
Yeah,
I appreciate
Candace
that. Thank
and I
you.
are both big readers, so I feel like maybe I'll have to add that to my
list.
My ever-growing to be read list.
That's the thing. There's, we as farmers, be us female or male, we're so busy. Finding time for, passion pursuits is extremely challenging, whether it's reading or writing, or sometimes even just visiting with friends and taking a day to ourselves. It's just such a never-ending task list that it can be challenging to do. So, yeah, that's awesome. If you decide to read it, send me an email. Let me know what you think.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, that brings us to our last question. And since you've listened to our podcast, I'm sure you know what's coming. What does being a woman in ag mean to you?
Being a woman in ag, to me, is it's a challenging answer for me. I heard, I think it was your most recent podcast, the woman said how many women would have defined themselves as farm wives when they were actually farmers. And that resonated with me, because I think I may have even said in a column one time, I saw myself as the farmer's wife, not as the farmer. And, I have found that I am stronger than I thought I was. I'm more capable in a lot of ways than I thought I was. But I would 100% hands down to choose to be the farmer's wife if given the option. I think that the acceptance of more niche farming has done a lot of good things for women who wanted to be farmers. Not necessarily large cattle production type things, but the apiaries and the agritainment and just all the different avenues that are now open to anyone and that are more widely accepted as agriculture. I think that's a wonderful thing for the industry as a whole and for women. But I do have that whole struggle still emotionally with, I wouldn't have chosen this. So that's a complicated question, and I hope that's an acceptable answer to it.
Absolutely. I feel like, we always kind of joke that we save the big question for last. And the thing is, like, there is no right or wrong way to answer it, because it's such a personal thing to everyone that we have on this podcast. It's a very personal question. And so, yeah, I mean, there's nothing that we expect people to say, right? It's how you truly feel and what it really means to you. So,
sure.
I think that wraps it up for us. Laura, thank you so much for joining us in the farmhouse today.
Thank you for having me. This was a ton of fun.
I'm so glad that we got to talk to Laura. I've been really fascinated with her journey and everything she's been through. I can't recommend enough reading her column, of family, faith, and farming. Again, you can find it at lancasterfarming.com.
Yeah, I totally agree. Her column is great. I thought talking to her was just, like you said, she's such a unique story and such an emotional story. And, I just really appreciated her perspective and, how she talked about, is this part of your life? Is this a season of life, or is this your lifestyle? And that's such an interesting way to look at it when you're feeling really overwhelmed by work or by family things or whatever. It's like, is this something that's going to last a season, or is this something that is going to last a lifetime? And I feel like that's such a nice way to kind of put things in perspective of handling stress and handling just the everyday demands of life.
Right. It's so much easier to get through something if you know that it's temporary.
Yeah.
And if you realize that it isn't temporary, then you can start, taking the steps you need to take to get yourself out of that situation. And I can't imagine, I'm married, and I can't imagine being in the situation that she was and just having to, almost start over again, digging yourself out and figuring out, all right, how does my life go on from here? And I say that as someone who doesn't have a farm to take care of.
Yeah.
I just have, a family, but even so, it's a big deal. It's one of the most stressful things that can happen to you, your spouse passing away. And so to hear that she has successfully kept the farm going, she has done that along with maintaining her off-farm job. She's written and published a book in the meantime. It's pretty amazing what she's been able to accomplish.
Absolutely. And I think those of you who have listened to the podcast long enough, that Candace and I do not farm, right? Like, we work for a farming newspaper, so we understand farming, but we are not farmers ourselves. But I just think what she talked about of, being able to give yourself grace when you can't necessarily get everything done. That applies to everyone. Especially women, I think,
Absolutely.
Like, we always feel like we are the ones who have to accomplish everything. And it's okay sometimes if you don't always get everything done.
And it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel really inspired after talking to Laura, and I really hope you all do too after hearing this interview. What an incredible woman and an incredible story.
Yeah, agreed.
That'll wrap us up here at the Farmhouse. Thank you all for listening. If you have anything you want to ever say to us, we have an email address. It's farmhouse@lancasterfarming.com. So feel free to reach out. Follow us on the socials. We're on Instagram and TikTok as @Lancaster Farming. We're on Facebook as Lancaster Farming as well.
And if you're enjoying this show, please feel free to leave a review or a good rating for us on wherever you're listening to it. That always helps.
Yeah, and maybe subscribe if you would like. That would be fun too. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. We love having you here at the Farmhouse. I'm Stephanie.
I'm Candace.
And we will talk to you all later. Bye. This episode of The Farmhouse is copyright 2024 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family.
It was written by Stephanie Spiker and Candace Wierzbowski. It was produced by Eric Herlock and Matt Lee. The music you've heard throughout the show is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow.